Hello, and welcome to Semantic Reactions, the official podcast of the Institute of General Semantics. My name is Ben Hauk, and I'm pleased to be able to introduce the 10th episode in our ongoing series. For our June 2023 podcast, Lance Straight interviews writer, educator, and general semantics expert, Mary Lahman. Dr. Lahman is Professor Emerita of Communication Studies at Manchester University in Indiana, and the author of Awareness and Action, published by the Institute of General Semantics. She is also a member of the IGS Board of Trustees. Their discussion deals with communication as a field of study, the theory and practice of listening, and teaching on the topic of general semantics. Let's listen in.
Well, we're here for the 10th episode of Semantic Reactions, the official podcast of the Institute of General Semantics. And I'm very happy to be speaking today with Mary Lahman, one of our trustees of the Institute of General Semantics. And Mary is Professor Emerita of Communication Studies at Manchester University. Now, that's not Manchester, England, is it, Mary?
No, definitely not. The cornfields of Indiana.
What town is it located in?
It's actually located in North Manchester, Indiana. We don't know why it says North because there's not a Manchester. We are North Manchester, Indiana.
Which, of course, brings us back to the map is not the territory. And neither the name is not the thing, but that's always a good lesson to be reminded of. And since you are recently retired, hence the Emerita status, why don't we go back to the beginning and how did you get involved in academia to begin with? Where did you start out as far as your college career?
I actually am an alum of Manchester. At the time, it was called Manchester College, and did 4 years there and then did a master's at Miami of Ohio and a PhD from IU. And
IU is?
Indiana University.
Okay.
Again, recognize where you are contextually, right? Thank you. I knew I did not want to head into education, like teaching right after my master's. And so I decided I'd hang out in the real world, and I'm using air quotes there, the real world, and decided that I would try my life marketing rep for Eastman Kodak Company in upstate New York. So it took small town girl to upstate New York and Rochester. And I spent 4 years there and then returned to the Midwest and got married and promised my husband I would never do another marketing sales job. And actually taught at Indiana, Purdue, Fort Wayne. Actually, I taught a summer class for Manchester in language and thought, and that was the beginning at Manchester when I was a student, but then also teaching it, which was general semantics. So that's my introduction into that.
Wow.
But I only did that for a bit, and then I went to work for Johnson & Johnson, again for 7 years, finding my way finally back to the classroom after those 11 years in the business world.
So you were involved in general semantics early on.
I was. My mentor, who his last year of teaching, his name's Paul Keller. And he studied with Irving Lee at Northwestern. Oh. So we were lucky to have a standalone language and thought class, a general semantics class at Manchester, which between his time and my time coming back, my colleagues also taught. So it is still being taught in my absence, language and thought.
Well, that's wonderful. So you are the intellectual grandchild of Irving Lee.
Yeah, how fascinating is that?
So you got into general semantics at that point. So that goes back to your early days as a student. And you taught the class then? and then you went off back into the corporate world. How did you kind of rejoin the general semantics fold?
Lance, we said that at the General Semantics seminar, right? How did I get to Alverno? I don't remember. There must have been some sort of flyer, or I was on the website. I don't know. But I knew that I really wanted to dig deeper into this gift I had been given of this class. And at that point, I was using William Haney's book. Now, William Haney was in the same classes with Paul Keller, so they both studied under Irving Lee. And his book wasn't called Interpersonal Communication, but it had all of the general semantics principles, and he referred to them as patterns of miscommunication. And then he gave you tools for how to handle the patterns of miscommunication. So that's the understanding I took to Alverno, and it was the summer of 2002, so 21 years ago.
Who was teaching that at Alverno then?
So I believe Steve Stockdale was the lead teacher.
Executive director.
And Milton Dawes was there, and Bruce Kodish.
And why don't you tell us a little about your memories of that course and of the three instructors? How did they? I imagine they were quite different. I'm really only familiar with Milton Dawes, who's always a pleasure to listen to him give a talk.
Yeah, Milton would always say, it's the calculus. It's the calculus. And did a lot of musical, what I referred to them as nonverbal awareness exercises. I'm not sure actually what they referred to them as, but every day we did something to get ourselves to the nonverbal level. And that was a piece that I didn't have before I went to this conference. So we were each given a term that we had to define and present to the class. I was given multi-ordinality, which I thought was the toughest term.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
I thought I was given the toughest term, but you were so involved every day doing something that the time just flew by. And I can remember breaks sitting on the curb with Milton Dawes, just talking about how the word is not the thing, the map is not the territory. And we had all these very practical examples. But the first exercise we did was they filled 3 containers with water. One was cold, one was hot, and one was lukewarm, but you didn't know that. They didn't tell you what was in them. You just had to come up, put your hands in, and then you put both hands in the center. And so the whole idea, right, is the water felt just the opposite, right? The cold felt warm and the warm felt cold. And Korzybski used this experiment to remind us that the difference in the feel came from the former conditions to which our hands were in. Thus, the language of our senses is not very reliable, and we can't depend on it. Mm-hmm. And I would use after that, to me, that just was the epitome of what students need to know. Another one that Corey uses is, okay, where's your lap? All right, stand up. Where did your lap go? Where's your lap? So this whole idea, the word is not the thing, and our senses are not reliable, and we only take a small amount of detail from that sensory level was probably the biggest impact of Alverno for me.
And you use the term nonverbal, but of course, in general semantics, it's used a little differently than in communication proper.
Correct. And students, I have to reinforce that every time. Thanks for saying that. I think we even did that in our seminar last week.
Yeah, we did.
This is not nonverbal as you think about nonverbal. This is the perceptual level of your interaction with the environment. And I think that's a hard distinction for people to no, because they think of nonverbal as the traditional eye contact, head nods, gestures, those kind of things.
Right. As opposed to that, and that's what you were just talking about, the sensory awareness.
I think the other thing that I'm not sure we did, or if I read about it later, but you had to answer 2 questions. What structures emerged as a function of that exercise? And of course, people are like, what do you mean by structures? I'm just whatever emerged that you put structure around, what was it? And then what meanings did you conclude? And those 2 questions remind you constantly that there's abstraction happening. You put structure where it may not be, and that we evaluate. So we make conclusions based on these limited details. And Bruce Kodish calls that think, feel, evaluate.
As one
As
unified concept.
with hyphens. Yeah.
Along with teaching that language and thought, was that a course? Was that the name of it again? Language.
It is. Yeah.
What other classes were you teaching at Manchester?
I was the generalist in the group. So I got most of my teaching load was our Foundations of Human Communication course. And then I got the intercultural course. I taught a class called Communication for Instructors. I taught a Rhetoric of War class, and then most recently developed a listening class.
You said Rhetoric of
War.
Of war. Oh.
Yeah, for an institution that is the first peace studies program in the nation. They always thought I had that labeled incorrectly, but it allowed me to use a lot of rhetorical criticism methods, and also to bring in like the metaphors.
Yeah. Oh, I remember there was a course of that, an undergraduate course along those lines. I think that was even the name of it when I was doing my master's at Queens College. Very interesting topic, and sadly one that continues to be relevant.
Unfortunately.
And we both share an interest in listening as well. And you recently chided me for saying the phrase "just listen."
You took that in good spirits.
Yeah, but do you want to say something about why you felt the need to insult me in this way? No, I mean why you felt the need to correct that phrase or object to that phrase.
Right. I think it's actually a Klein article in Etc. where he talks about we don't just listen. We listen. There are different purposes for listening. We're listening to understand. We're listening to empathize. We're listening to critique or evaluate. And so we don't, I think it goes back really with Bruce Kodish saying we think, feel, evaluate. So we're constantly have a purpose for why it is we're listening. And it's great for indexing the type of listening that's needed for the moment. And unfortunately, in the United States, our culture is fix it. And so the empathy listening is very difficult to do. We don't want people to hurt. We don't want people to feel bad. And of course, we have great suggestions for them. They need to hear our suggestions for how we can fix it. So, yeah, we don't just listen. We tend to have a purpose in what we're listening for.
Yeah. And it's also that idea of many different types of listenings, which, making plurals is another kind of device that Wendell Johnson recommends, and that it brings us further down, to just look at listening as one thing is to be higher up in abstraction, and to bring it down is to differentiate between different types of listening.
And it really does help you do I think we talked about in the seminar, the metaphor for conflict is argument, that's one thing. If it's dance, then you start to realize that there are all these ways you can do the listening dance.
And of course, that's a reference to Lakoff and Johnson's
Mhm.
metaphor theory, which is very relevant again for general semantics.
If I can say more too about listening.
Please,
Yeah.
I'll listen if you do.
We listen to and for different things. And so when you say just listen, some of us are listening for facts. Some of us are listening for the emotion that we think the speaker has or that's going on in the story they're telling. Some of us listen for ideas, so we start connecting things. So we listen for these different things. And Lance, you did that great exercise with listing the 12 things. And it was about a bed and a comfort and night and right. And we all said the word sleep was in the list of what Lance said, right? And if you listen for ideas, you're kind of adding the word sleep, even though it's not there, because you're connecting things in different ways. So when Lance asked me to report what I heard, I also added warmth because he said comfort. And I added dark because he said night. So if you think about it, we not only have a purpose for listening, but listening is a cognitive process that we do automatically, and our default goes to one of those types of listening. So yeah, facts, ideas, and then emotions, but also then experiences. Does this line up with anything I've learned before? And we're constantly processing information that way too.
And with all of these different techniques, I mean, the listening, the interpersonal communication, and of course, the general semantics proper, and you've spent many years teaching undergraduates, mostly traditional age.
Correct.
But you've also been working in corporate consulting and education. What's the difference between the two?
Great question. About 10 years ago, one of our vice presidents said, "Hey, would you be interested in doing executive education?" I said, "Absolutely." And so I became the listening piece, the communication piece of their whole curriculum. And the thing we always say sometimes, and again, I shouldn't use always there, but the thing we say about traditional age is that you don't have the experience to apply all the cool things we're teaching. And the executives, number one, they know their management has paid for this. So there's a cost involved to you being there. And there's limited time. You're only together for an hour and a half. And so their attention is peaked, I think, more than going class to class to class. And I think they see, and we typically use whatever's going on for that organization. Like, is retention a big issue for you? Okay, let's work through retention issues. So there's something very current for them that they need. And so they can't wait to hear more about it. And they can't wait to apply the concepts, which may be a little different than undergraduates.
I imagine so.
I did at the beginning of my career teach language and thought to master's level accountants. And that's why
accountants.
Yeah, that's why the Haney book was so good, because it was all written from a business perspective. And there was a lot of interest there because the way the case studies were written, they knew they would need to be keyed in on the language that their clients were using, and they needed to listen.
Well, we always say how general semantics is so much practical utility and has had so much success with folks in business, in the professions, and other areas of life. So that makes perfect sense. I guess the problem then is getting the young students interested in it then, huh?
Well, I find that, I think it's interesting that I said we appeal to whatever's going on in the organization. What I find teaching, when I taught language and thought if I could tie it to if it was a travel course and where we were going, or if it was an in-person class, what argument do you have over and over again? And then they picked, oh, racism is an issue for me. Sexism is an issue. And so they would pick a controversial topic and then see how extensional devices really made a difference in those conversations. So I think they appreciated that. And the online course, you could watch their thinking progress as you watch them interact with each other.
Well, we should get to some of those, but it's certainly the case that you're recognized as one of the great teachers of general semantics in our time. I know you're laughing at that, but you did receive the Berman Award when it was first set up for teaching general semantics. And was that when you first got involved, more recently with the Institute?
I'm trying to remember the year that was. Corey, was it 14? I don't remember. I think what got me back with the Institute was when I'd used the Haney book and I'd used Bruce, the Codish and Codish book, Drive Yourself Sane. And my students would be like, do I have to carry this book around? They loved it, and it wasn't in a pedagogical order that made sense for me. So I wrote my first book called Awareness in Action and gave it to, I want to say, the Etc. Editor at the time. I think that's who I contacted. And then they published chapters of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that was back in 13.
But you did receive the award, and then...
Yeah, I think it was after that. I think it was right after that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then I know that a version of it was published as a PDF.
That's the one. And it was in 13.
And then a revised version. And one of the great things about the revised version is the inclusion of a chapter on listening was published as part of the IGS book publishing program.
Yeah, let me contrast those two, why they're different. The first one, because Haney used all those cases and they worked so well for accounting folks, when I moved away from just teaching that master's level of language and thought, I was working primarily with undergraduate students across a variety of majors. I decided I should have them write case studies. And so that book was, that PDF file includes their case studies. And I thought they wrote them so well. They said, here's what's going on. And here's how we can use the devices to make a difference. We have trouble with the security guard getting into the library at night. What can we do? The same cross-country team takes over the space that the football team's in. Just things that were important to them that then could get passed on from student to student. And the reason I bring up that security one is then Steve Stockdale had us do the MOOC, and that security issue did not cross international understanding. So I really needed the case studies to come out of another book that then was more guided closely for Corey and Marty to say, hey, you've got to put in enough general semantics history here, the Korzybski beginnings. And then for me, where I thought it was unique, and I'm glad you said that, is the listening chapter, because we teach folks that the abstraction, each level is about the other. Mm-hmm. And I think the same case can be made that listening is a multi-step process and each part is about the other. So what I hear, what I receive, and then what I add meaning to is about what I received. And then what questions, the way I can respond is about the meaning that I've made. So I thought that was just a interesting way to pull one of the senses out and say, not only are we have the next level is about the level before, but then within one of those senses, it's a multi-level process.
In the earlier version is freely available. The new version is one that we sell. It has the subtitle, A Traveling Companion. Why is that?
Good question. So I needed to distinguish the two, and I wanted it to be this thin notebook, because if you're going to learn general semantics, to me, you've got to take notes. You've got to, when something happens that we call them language and thought moments, my students, my family, my friends, we go, oh, that was a language and thought moment. I thought you meant this by the word eagle. I didn't mean that, So when we had those moments, we could take notes. And I was using the book with students traveling to Egypt and to Israel and to Greece. And so it's thin and it's small and it fits right in your bag. And a lot of students said to me, I will forget this. I want this in my workplace. And so again, it was small and it could go in your briefcase or backpack, whatever you use. So that's how the travel companion part came of it. And also the little places to take notes throughout it.
Yeah. And can you tell us about those classes? So that sounds really fascinating. I think we often think about teaching general semantics and not thinking all that much about where we're teaching it, or that it is done in a classroom or in a particular, one specific place. It must be a whole other animal to be teaching it on the run, so to speak, or on the road, and especially traveling to new places and other cultures. So please, let's hear something about those experiences.
Thank you. Those are some of my favorite stories. So especially Egypt, because you're in all these temples. My students are like, this one young lady one day, and you're listening to a guide all the time, all day long, on the bus, at the site. And she says, I'm sorry, Professor Lahman, but Temple 1 is not Temple 2, is not Temple 3, is not doing me any good. I can't listen anymore. And I said, hey, how is this temple different than the one we were at before? And she's like, this one was built for a woman. And I said, yes. And so she was in, right? And they also make fun of each other on trips at a certain point. And so when we would meet after dinner and they'd have to talk about what they had learned that day, inevitably they would say, I made the assumption. And here's what, and they would have to say, here's what was going on. We were eating, overlooking the Sphinx, and then they would say, and I was really upset with Jill. And here's the assumption I made. And then they would have to apply the extensional device. And they would say, if only I would have remembered that, this setting is different from that setting, or this person is different in that setting. So it became a real way to build community. So I love that. And then the IFD disease was their favorite, because there's a cruise on the Nile, and a lot of these students haven't been traveled outside of the United States. And so the airfare is really important. And then cruise, they thought they were going to be on a big cruise ship. And it's a little tiny ship, because it has to go down the Nile. And so I meet this student out in the food area, and he says, I am so suffering from IFD disease. I wanted this cruise to look like this. And now I know I'm frustrated. And if I don't stop it, I'm not going to learn what I need to learn. And so there were all those moments where they just were immediately applying I had this ideal, right, of what travel would be, and it's not that. It's hard, and if we could talk about it at the frustration level, we kept them from phoning home. I mean, you could keep them thinking about. Yeah, it was good. Thanks for asking. Those are three of my favorite examples.
Sounds like it was a wonderful experience for them, and also a great way to learn about general semantics. If you're traveling, your senses and your awareness are really opening up, and you have to be.
Yeah, and they had to create a time binding plan at the end. So they'd use their pictures from the trip, and they'd create a travel brochure, and they'd be like, etc. is needed to survive while traveling. And they really did a great job with a lot of those. Several of those, by the way, are published in etc. because Tom was so open to time binding plans and case studies and all the things that students get out of these courses. So it's a good place to look.
Yeah, etc. is a great place to publish those and get students involved as well. So yeah, I always look forward to, or I have looked forward to those contributions in our journal. I wanted to actually note, earlier on you mentioned Corey and Marty, that those are references to Corey Anton, who is IGS Vice President and also the head of the publishing program for the IGS, and Marty Levinson, who is the past president and who was president when you joined the Board of Trustees. Do you remember when you became a trustee of the Institute?
Oh, I should, Lance. I don't.
Okay. Well, there's a failure of time binding, I suppose, but we'll let that go. But what have been your impressions of the Institute from inside the organization?
I would love to give a shout out to Lance at this point because it is stunning the amount of work that goes on behind Ben Corey and Ava, right? I mean, and Marty is a former in charge. You tend to think it's the AMLK, right?
AKML.
AKML, my bad. AKL. Just say Alfred Krzyzewski Memorial Lecture, right? There's also all the new things that we're trying to do to get more people to have access to such practical tools. And whether that's creating a bookmark that we can use with students, being able to think through, do we need podcasts? Do we need online seminars? How can we help people use the tools, right, for their lives? Yeah. And all the work that Tom does as editor and Ed did before and Bill did before that. I mean, just the incredible work.
Tom Giancarelli and Bill Petcanis is, I think.
Right. And Ed Tuaniak?
Ed Tuaniak, yes.
Yeah.
Our previous three editors.
Yeah. There's just a lot of work there. And I think you don't see that if you're not involved.
And speaking of our activities, we just recently held a 3-day in-person seminar. It's an introduction to general semantics. And that's the first in-person seminar since those days at Alverno that you remember so fondly, and I think you're the only one who actually experienced that, of least of those of us who are involved in the seminar. For those who are not familiar with it, if you haven't been paying attention to our newsletter, the seminar was led by Mary, along with myself and Corey Anton, with also an assist from Ava Berger. And we had about 20 odd students in the seminar. Odd, I don't mean odd people, but 20 something, they were 21, 22, somewhere in that number. And I think it went very well. I mean, what are your thoughts about the in-person seminar, Mary?
Well, Lance kind of knows. He might remember this conversation in Bryant Park when I was trying to convince them that we needed this in-person seminar because of what a difference it had made in my teaching and my living of general semantics. And I wanted to have it at Manchester. And I think Lance and Corey are like, yeah, no. But it worked so well, I think, to have it before media ecology conference so that folks were in town for that. It allowed Laura to bring students from Mexico, which was important in the class, important for their development and understanding of general semantics, and really important for us as teachers and learners. Did just some of the highlights for me. The first day was
just before, since you mention it, just to spell it out for our listeners, that our seminar was set up as a kind of pre-conference right before the annual meeting of the Media Ecology Association in New York. And Laura Trujillo from Mexico brought many of her students with her. Laura is also a trustee, but she took the class as a student to learn how we do things and how general semantics is taught, and then stayed on for the MEA convention. I'm sorry, Mary, but please continue.
No, thank you. I really appreciate how Lance clarifies my use of acronyms and first names, because that's listening. Not helpful. Yeah. Not helpful for me not to have all those written down. So the first day was all about the map is not the territory and abstracting. And we had them introduce themselves with the name writer, and their definition of writer. And I think we had, 16 different definitions of who is a writer, what does a writer do, right? And then Lance immediately turned to what's science. So we had 32 definitions of science. And so it was very clear that the map is not the territory. And then I had them do a structural differential worksheet where they actually had to, when they came back from lunch, talk about their lunch in terms of what they had seen and heard, and then how they made judgments from that. And my favorite takeaway from that experience was when one of the participants said, I get it. The object is not to agree with where we are on the abstraction letter, but to understand, And I just thought that was the highlight for me. That and one of the participants said, why are you using quotes around the word good? And so it was just a great beginning to, oh my goodness, language uses us. We use language, but it uses us. And I told Lance, I thought the objective of the day was, it really made sense. We need to make more accurate and useful maps. My other favorite at that day was Lance showing all the maps videos. That it makes no sense how we look at global maps, who's north, who's south. Yeah. Was that the vortex video too? Or was that the next day?
No, that was yeah.
Yeah. So we laughed about how the things we did built on each other, but I think they really appreciated the mix of instructors, of some videos, of some worksheets, of some exercises, where the group, I think I already referred to this before, the group heard the word sleep and it was never, we agreed that sleep is there. So there were all these, again, moments where you're not just thinking about your thinking, but you are moving as an organism as a whole through the environment. And I think that became real, that they read those concepts in a book, but I think it became real. Yeah, those are some of my highlights of day one. Lance, do you have other highlights?
Well, I think it was all great, but I really want to hear from you, Mary.
Well, to me, day two was fun too, because it was called The Word is Not the Thing, which we focused on verbal awareness, which Lance got to do the Christine Nystrom metaphor exercise, which is just eye-popping for people to realize that all language is metaphor. And Corey had done, the difference between signal and symbol, and this idea that we need to be both on autopilot and have questions. And I think that was the day where the participants were really saying, okay, where do I need to be on the abstraction ladder? Or where do I need to be in the structural difference? Or what are you saying? And it was the both and, I think, that day. Stay away from dead level abstracting. We need to move and we need to know where we are. And that's a more useful map. And it also became the delay responding, I think, that day. And we came back from lunch and I had them tell me everything they had learned, because we're halfway through the seminar, and they filled the board. And I said, how amazing is it that you know all this now? But my favorite one from that was, we see things not as they are, but as we are. So they really got it. The third day was all about, I don't think the third day was where Corey was walking into walls, but he did have us talk about what's beautiful and the fact that the objects we use are actually events. And so I think that became very real as well. And on day two, we had used indexes and dates. And on day three, we used et cetera. And I think they really started to see why Korzybski developed extensional devices to make more accurate maps. And my favorite thing on indexes is when there's someone, a group of people you think you have trouble agreeing with. It's like one of the participants said, I want to just say, what do you see? What do you see that I don't see? Now that I know I can't possibly see it all, what do you see that I don't see? And another one talked about indexing his roles. It's not just indexing the other people that we see, but ourselves. How am I different as a worker, and how am I different as a husband? How do those roles differ?
Yeah,
so just some great
point.
examples from what they learned. And of course, et cetera. If we're truly humble, we're curious and we ask questions.
I love that, the way you made that point about the necessity of humility, tying that into, in a sense, feeling as opposed to just a purely intellectual understanding that you can never say all there is to say, but to approach it with humility, I think is just a beautiful sentiment.
Yeah, and even again, Lance, as they were learning, they're like, but wait a minute, if genuine humility is I'm going to go into it asking questions, then I'm not being spontaneous. So don't I need to be spontaneous first? So just some great back and forths and applicable to their lives as lawyers and doctors and therapists. Just the examples that were used will help them in their work lives. And then Michelle did a nice thank you for us at the end, right?
Michelle shocked,
Yeah, the performance.
But I will just add the fact inference.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Yes, of course. We ended with fact inference. And that's another Christine Nystrom. And that Lance has to say to people, they aren't all inferences, because at this point in your understanding of general semantics, nothing is, everything is abstracted. So you're like, well, it could all be an inference. So just teasing out how something is an inference or a fact based on, and again, we were looking at written words, which is hard to do. Imagine how hard it is when you're talking to someone, but just that, yeah.
Yeah, it was very sweet that they all signed this, because we gave everyone certificates, which so kind of returns us to that intercultural aspect. If it's something that is commonplace and actually something that's kind of desirable in Latin American countries, and maybe, and I believe other parts of the world, that when you take a class, you're actually handed signed certificates, certifying that you've completed the class, even though it's not, say a 3-credit college class, but just this kind of seminar. So we had them made up, and for all of the students in this general semantics seminar, and signed them and gave them out. And in return, we were given a signed certificate from all of the students in the class, handwritten, but heartfelt and beautiful.
Yeah, beautiful experience and practical. I felt like we got a lot of thank you for how practical, and we know that is why general semantics is a practical tool.
Practical and yet profound in this very interesting way. Just eye-opening.
Now you know why I say language and thought moment. It's profound. I like that.
And for those who weren't able to take the class, or even if they wanted to take a different version of it, a different variation, we are offering a completely online asynchronous class that, Mary, that you yourself are doing solo in August. Do you want to say a few words about what you'll be doing there?
Absolutely. I tend to always think that classes are a gift to yourself. And I want you to think about this class as being a gift to the person you argue with the most. We're actually going to use all of the principles, the non-identity, non-allness, and self-reflexiveness, tied specifically to an ongoing disagreement that you have with someone in your life. So there are exercises that help you work through it. Other folks in the class will give you insight, and that's probably my favorite part of asynchronous learning, is people can put their responses in whenever they have time to really think through it, and they can see the thread of thinking as it works through. And so I just think that's the beauty of online learning. There are videos of me talking, and there are exercises. There are the nonverbal awareness exercises. There's a really interesting episode from The Twilight Zone. And so there are just some fun learning tools along with some real practical application and insights you'll get from others.
And this is a class you've developed for over many years.
I have. I developed this class before the pandemic, before people, I really used a lot of, what did we call it back in the day when you had, I don't remember, before online courses, but you had the first thing I think was called NetSense or a wiki or whatever, where you could have students respond to each other and work with each other outside of the classroom. And what
Like
it
bulletin
allowed,
boards.
what it allowed was for people to have time to think, because some of us can't come up with that answer right away in a classroom. and process some of the material outside of the classroom. And you could get more people talking. Obviously, they were writing, but just some really good insights. And so I used that years and years ago. And then because we have what's called a January term, I developed this hybrid class where we could be traveling and then back, or you could work the entire January and take the class online. So that was all pre-pandemic. So I really believed in online learning way before we had to do it.
That certainly means you have a lot of experience in teaching an online class, and I do one as well that's asynchronous, and the beauty of that is that students can pop in and do the work at their own pace, and at times that are convenient to them, which also makes it possible to take the class from all different parts of the world.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, it's certainly something to look forward to, and you can sign up for that class on the IGS website. It's under the events, so please do consider that. Mary, this has been wonderful. Is there anything we haven't talked about, or is there something else that you would like to share with us?
I think I'll just end with, first of all, thank you, because you brought up some amazing memories of mine. My mentor said, prepare to be proven wrong. And so I think if we really embody general semantics, we have to be wrong because we only have part of the information. But try to find the fun in that. Try to find the play in that, not the straitjacket. And I think language is an amazing tool. It's an inaccurate tool, but it's all we have. So let's have some fun playing with it.
I love that. Play is so important, and it's why we're also open to, the one hand, there's the science, and let's get serious about things, but there's also the playfulness, the art of it, and just having a good time. Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm experimenting with haikus, because they actually, you have 5 syllables and 7, then 5. And so much like when we learned to use Twitter, we were more exact with our language. We find different words, and I'm not going to say better, but different words that maybe describe our emotion and our experience in a more observant way. And so I think that's the playfulness, I hope, for us, that gives us this incredible insight. I actually hadn't thought about this, but I can read you one. Please. That I thought was really insightful. When you look at me and ask a follow-up question, there's rare listening air.
Love it.
Good way to end.
It is. Mary Lahman, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Semantic Reactions.
Thank you, Lance.
You've been listening to our June 2023 episode of Semantic Reactions, featuring an interview with IGS trustee Mary Lahman. If you like what you've heard, or even if you haven't, please consider becoming a member of the Institute of General Semantics, if you're not one already. In addition to supporting our efforts, IGS members receive an annual subscription to our journal, etc., a review of general semantics, access to our online and in-person events, lectures, and seminars, and discounts on the books and audiovisual materials that we sell. Regular membership is only $50 and half off for students. Your membership and any additional donations you care to make will help to support our offerings and activities as we work to bring a measure of sanity to the world. The Institute of General Semantics is a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to research and education on a wide range of topics. They include language and symbols, meaning and perception, communication and representation, media and technology, science and epistemology, creativity, and critical thinking. We are dedicated to making the world a better place through practical strategies for improving our semantic environment, individually and collectively. For more information about the Institute and our activities, and to become a member and supporter of our work, please visit our website at generalsemantics.org. That's General Semantics, one word, .org. And this brings to a close our 10th episode of Semantic Reactions, the official podcast of the Institute of General Semantics. This is Ben Houck, signing off, saying, we hope you'll join us next time. And until then, just remember this simple fact, that the map is not the territory.